So the topic this morning, which you will see in a moment, is really about a question that has been on my mind, and that's probably on the minds of a lot of people from time to time when they consider God's Word. And in many ways, it is an attack that people will bring against God's Word. Last week, we talked about morality and about knowing right and wrong by using the Bible. And a lot of people will say, well, the Bible is a terrible guide to what's right and wrong. Look at all the terrible things that are in it. And one thing they might point to is the slavery that was sanctioned in the Mosaic law. It was a law that was given to Moses, but it was handed down to him from God. And that raises a lot of questions and concerns for a lot of people, and it's something I've been thinking about and wanted to study and look into more. And I think there's a couple of reasons why it's beneficial to ask questions like this and to seek answers from God's Word. One reason is so that we would have an answer to someone else if they were to ask us a difficult question like that. But another reason is because we might have our own genuine questions and concerns that we would want to figure out about this. It should be noted that when asking, why did the Mosaic law allow slavery, our answer is not a justification for slavery. Our answer is a justification for a God who allowed it to be in that law, and a question of why he did that. So I hope that we can bear that in mind this morning. And the typical answer that you might give to someone or that you might hear when someone asks that question, I guess those batteries were bad too. So typical answer that you would get is, we are not under the old law anymore. Ephesians 2:15 says Jesus ended the system of law with its commandments and regulations. And in Colossians 2:14 we learn that the old law was nailed to Jesus' cross and that it is no longer binding on us. So it is important to establish and to understand that we are no longer under the old law. There are a lot of reasons why that is good to know. But maybe that's not a satisfactory answer to you by itself. Just to know, well, we're not under the old law, yes, but isn't the God who gave the old law the same one who sent Jesus and who's given us the New Testament as well? And did he change between the writing of the Old and the New Testament? So I want to tell you that the answer to this question as we look into it is going to be in two parts. First is understanding what the Mosaic Law actually says about slavery. It would be a shame for us to believe that the Old Testament said all kinds of terrible things that it didn't actually say. And we may have been assuming that the Old Testament sanctions slavery in a way that it doesn't actually. But the second part is, I think, the most important part of answering the question, and that is understanding the purpose of the law of Moses and understanding what it means when anything was written in the law that God gave to Moses. A good place to start is actually in the New Testament when we answer that first question, what does the law actually say about slavery? Because here in 1 Timothy 1, 8 through 11, Paul is talking to Timothy about the old law. And he says, we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully, realizing the fact that the law is not made for a righteous person, but for those who are lawless and rebellious, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and profane, for those who kill their fathers or mothers, for murderers and immoral men and homosexuals and kidnappers and liars and perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound teaching, according to the glorious gospel of the blessed God with which I have been entrusted. And the word kidnappers there has a orientation that is specifically referring to slavery. So that in the NIV and the English Standard Version of the Bible, they correctly render it as slave traders and liars and perjurers and whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine, or enslavers, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound doctrine. And if you look back at 1 Timothy 1, he says the law is for these kinds of people: lawless, rebellious, ungodly, sinful, unholy, profane, such as enslavers, slave traders, kidnappers. And you might wonder, well, how could Paul say that the law was against that? Because I thought that the law made provisions for slavery. Well, Paul was probably referring to Exodus 21:16, which says, "He who kidnaps a man, whether he sells him or he is found in his possession, shall surely be put to death." And Exodus 21 is one of the main chapters that is full of information to Israel about having slaves or indentured servants. So it's within that context that the people of Israel were told, kidnapping a man, whether you sell him or not, shall surely be put to death. And we're even told that if you kidnap someone and sell them to someone else, you can both be put to death because of this. It makes it clear that the means by which someone entered into this Old Testament slavery was not through kidnapping. You see a way in which it could be entered into here in Leviticus 25:47 through 49. "If a foreigner residing among you becomes rich, and any of your fellow Israelites become poor, and sell themselves to the foreigner or to a member of the foreigner's clan, they retain the right of redemption after they have sold themselves. One of their relatives may redeem them, an uncle or a cousin or any blood relative in their clan may redeem them. Or if they prosper, they may redeem themselves." So there's two reasons why this is a good passage to help us understand the slavery of the Old Testament. One is that it indicates how someone would enter into that slavery, and it is by incurring a debt. Normally it would be a financial debt, but there could also be a moral debt to society, for instance, after committing a crime, or if you are an enemy at war with Israel who is attempting to kill Israelites who is captured. And so in situations in which there is a debt that is owed, one could become either for life or for a temporary period of time a slave or a servant who was indentured because of that debt. Something else, though, that you notice from the passage is that a foreigner could have a Hebrew slave, and a Hebrew could have a Hebrew, or a Hebrew a non-Hebrew. There was no justification of slavery based on the race or the nationality of an individual. It was because of a debt that was owed between one individual and another. And it's remarkable to me that God even said a foreigner can have a Hebrew slave. So it was not ethnically or racially based, or not based on nationality. Here's another passage that demonstrates that. Exodus 21:2 through 6 says, "If you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve you for 6 years, but on the 7th he shall go out as a free man without payment. If he comes alone, he shall go out alone. If he is the husband of a wife, then his wife shall go out with him. If the master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall belong to her master, and he shall go out alone. But if the slave plainly says, 'I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out as a free man,' then his master shall bring him to God. Then he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him permanently." So one thing this passage establishes for us then is that once again, it was not based on ethnicity or nationality. A Hebrew could have another Hebrew as a slave. And it also starts to show you some of the provisions that God put into the law that were an attempt to protect people from injustices that could be done to them. The next thing that I'd like to establish and to point out is that killing a slave in a way that was premeditated was first-degree murder and was punished by the death penalty. So this first passage in Hebrew 21 just talks about the death penalty for first-degree murder in a basic sense, overall, between any person. It says, "Anyone who strikes a person with a fatal blow is to be put to death. However, if it is not done intentionally, but God lets it happen, they are to flee to a place I will designate. But if anyone schemes and kills someone deliberately, that person is to be taken from my altar and put to death." This is harsher than the American law code. This is a code that God gave to Moses. If it was a premeditated, intentional murder, then the penalty was the death penalty. The next few verses sort of give a situation and give some criteria for deciding whether this was that kind of murder or not. It says, if men have a quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and he does not die but remains in bed, if he gets up and walks around outside on his staff, then he who struck him shall go unpunished. He shall only pay for his loss of time and shall take care of him until he is completely healed. Now, notice the term unpunished in this passage about the death penalty means that the person won't receive the death penalty. They won't be put to death because of what they've done. And so remember that context as we look at verses 20 and 21 here. It says, if a man strikes his male or female slave with a rod, and he dies at his hand, he shall be punished, which means he shall receive the death penalty, or he shall be avenged is another correct translation here. If, however, he survives a day or two, no vengeance shall be taken, for he is his property. And many people have looked at this verse and complained a great deal that God would have allowed this to be in the law by saying if the slave didn't die or a day or two, there was no punishment. But this is a passage about first-degree murder, and the law is telling them there is not a death penalty if the master did not intend to kill the slave, and he would have good reason not to, because he had a monetary stake in that situation, as the slave was indebted to him to work for him. Now, why do you think it is that the murder of a slave would incur the death penalty? It's because God's image is on every person. Genesis 1:27 says, God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And the Israelites knew this and knew that it applied to every single person who has ever lived. And thus in Genesis 9 and verse 6 we read, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God he made man. And that was sort of the first instance where God suggested the death penalty for murder and gave the reason because the image of God was on that person. The image of God is on any person that's ever been made, whatever their social status, whether they be indebted to another, whether they be in indentured servitude to another or not, whether they be any ethnicity or race or nationality, man or woman, whatever the case may be. Murder in the old law, even in Genesis, resulted in the death penalty for that reason. And every person is accountable for their actions towards someone with God's image on them, which is why we see coming up in the New Testament, Ephesians 6:9. It says, masters, give up threatening, knowing that both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. And so we are all accountable to God, who is the master of all, for anything we do. And the people of Israel surely should have known that as well. Something else that needs to be pointed out is that the long-term injury of a slave resulted in their release. Exodus 21:26 and 27 says, an owner who hits a male or female slave in the eye and destroys it must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. And an owner who knocks out the tooth of a male or female slave must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. So if you think about this in terms of indebtedness, the slave had a debt to the master. Well, that debt was canceled out by the fact that the master had incurred a new debt to the slave by harming them in that way. And you could take a very legalistic approach and say this only applies to a tooth or to the eye. But the spirit of the law, of course, was that if you make a lasting injury in which you're indebted to the slave, your debts are canceled out and the slave can go free. And in fact, as we continue to look at more facts from the Bible here, the decision to run away was honored if a slave decided to run away. Deuteronomy 23:15 and 16 says, if a slave has taken refuge with you, do not hand them over to their master. Let them live among you, wherever they like, and in whatever town they choose. Do not oppress them. Which is kind of a fascinating addition to the law, perhaps to protect those who ran away because they were being treated unfairly. Something else to consider is that all people were required to have rest every week for an entire day. God said in Exodus 20, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." And I'm sure that God intentionally included your male or female servant in his command to rest for a full day every week, because he knew that they might be overlooked, that it might be more likely that they would be denied that rest that all people were commanded to take. And all people were told that they should enjoy the produce of the land through the feasts that Israel kept and the celebrations that they had. Deuteronomy 16, 9 through 12 says, "Count off 7 weeks from the time you begin to put the sickle to the standing grain. Then celebrate the festival of weeks to the Lord your God by giving a free will offering in proportion to the blessings the Lord your God has given you. And rejoice before the Lord your God at the place he will choose as a dwelling for his name. You, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, the Levites in your towns and the foreigners, the fatherless and the widows living among you. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and follow carefully these decrees." So they were to celebrate along with everyone in their household, including their servants. And this is one of several times when God reminded the people of Israel that they had been slaves in Egypt, as a reminder to them of how they would like to be treated and how they ought to treat others. Something else to consider, Deuteronomy 15 tells you to send away your slave with plenty. When you release them, do not send them away empty-handed. Supply them liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. Give to them as the Lord your God has blessed you. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. That is why I give you this command today. So another reminder for them to put themselves in someone else's shoes, to treat someone else the way that they would want to be treated, and specifically to send away one who had fulfilled their debt with plenty, with the produce of the land and of their own work. So here's a list of the things that we have mentioned. And slavery categorically may always be offensive to us, and perhaps it should always be offensive to us for the implications that it has. But it is important to notice before we go on, just so we know what was and was not in the Hebrew law. Kidnapping was always illegal, and that didn't matter whether they were from another nation or not. Now, if they were an enemy of war, that was a different case. The slave trade was illegal. There was not this buying and selling of people who hadn't done anything wrong based on the color of their skin or where they came from or any other reason. So slavery was not based on ethnicity or nationality. Non-Jews could have Jewish slaves, etc. First-degree murder of a slave was punishable by the death penalty. That was the punishment for it. Permanent injuries to slaves were compensated with release. The decision to run away was honored, and if you ran away, you were protected in that. Of course, you would not continue to pay off your debt that you had, but you would be free from that situation. A weekly day of rest and the Jewish celebration feasts could not be denied to slaves, and slaves should be released with plentiful goods. So I just say all that so that we don't have a misunderstanding about what was in the law, and so we know the protections that were in place, that there was not kidnapping and slave trade that was going on, that you couldn't just murder people and hurt people and expect no consequences, that we were supposed to treat people the way we would like to be treated. And so all of these things show that, for instance, in history of the United States, the Old Testament could not be used to support the kind of slavery that was going on in our country, which was based on kidnapping and a slave trade, and didn't have many protections in place. It went totally against the Jewish law. It would not have been allowed if God had given us our laws for our country. But next we go to talking about what it means when something is in the law to begin with, because you may still not be exactly satisfied with knowing that even this kind of slavery was permitted and sanctioned in the Old Testament. Although one thing I'd like to point out before we go on is that our society to this day takes away people's freedom because of debts that they incur to society. And imprisonment is probably the obvious example of that. Someone steals something or they do something wrong, they have a debt to society, and instead of inviting them to come and work with the family that they have wronged and to pay off their debt that way, we just put them behind bars, essentially put them in a cage and leave them there and take away their freedom. So you can see there's a sense in which all societies have deprived people of freedom because of debts that they owed, and perhaps our society does it in a less kind way than Israel did. But as we move on to thinking about why it was in the law at all, I'd like to give you 3 examples that illustrate the fact that God specifically making provisions for something in his law does not mean that he approves of that practice. And there's that written out for you. Just because a practice is sanctioned in the Mosaic law does not mean that God wants it to happen. The first example would be divorce law. God made provisions in the law for divorce for almost any reason. A husband could give his wife a certificate of divorce just without any input from her. He'd give her the certificate if she finds no favor in his eyes, the law said. And on the other hand, the apostles asked Jesus about this. They said, "Why then," they asked, "did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away?" And Jesus replied, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery." So you have an example of the law that was given to Israel, making provisions for them to do something. And later, when Jesus is asked about it, he says it was because of the hardness of your hearts, but it wasn't supposed to be that way from the beginning. Second example would be laws about having a king. Deuteronomy 17 was written long before Israel had a king, and it's full of all kinds of commandments concerning the future time when they would have a king. And yet God made it clear it was not his will for the people to have a king at all. He discouraged them from doing so, but they wanted to be like everyone else who was around them. So when they got a king in 1 Samuel 8:7, the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in regard of all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them." So God did not want them to have a king, and yet he gave them all these commandments about having a king. The third example would be polygamy. The Mosaic law permitted polygamy, and throughout the Old Testament, we see all these people who were in polygamous marriages. King David had many wives, and it appears that God gave him no instruction to the contrary. In fact, God even said, "I've given you many wives, and if that had not been enough, I would have given you more." I think polygamy is an example that should open our eyes to the fact that maybe God deals with a lot more wickedness or a lot more that isn't his ultimate will in people than we might realize, and has done so throughout history. In Genesis 2:24, it said, "A man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." And then in 1 Timothy 3:2, when instructions were given for elders or overseers, it says, "An overseer then must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, temperate, prudent, respectable, hospitable, able to teach." And so things that God allowed in the lives of the kings of Israel even, such as David, a man after his own heart, he asked not be present, and elders in the new church. Those are three examples of situations in which something was provided for under the law of Moses, and yet we know that it was not God's ultimate will. It was a provision because of the hardness of their hearts. And when you think about the context of Israel and the ancient Near East, and you look at the practices of all the nations around them, you can begin to understand how God was putting in laws in place for them to stop them from doing far worse than anything that they did, to seek to protect those who would be most vulnerable because of the customs of the people in that area. The law is described as a guardian in Galatians 3:23 through 25. But before faith came, we were kept in custody under the law, being shut up to faith which was later to be revealed. Therefore the law has become our tutor to lead us to Christ, so that we may be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer under a tutor. The word tutor could also be a guardian, someone who watches over, almost like a babysitter if you think about it, for Israel. All this time that they were going through history leading to God's Son coming into the world, the law was given to them to keep them in check, to prevent them from doing all kinds of things that they surely would have done, especially when you look at all that they did do that was terrible, even having been given the law that God gave to them. The final thing I'd like to remind us of is that all of the law fell under the umbrella of the two great commandments. One of them, a lawyer asked him, Jesus, a question, testing him. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And he said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets. And of course there was another time when Jesus was asked, who is my neighbor? And the story he told indicated that your neighbor is everyone. Your neighbor is the person that you like the least. The neighbor is whoever you happen to be around. And so anyone who was the neighbor of Israel was to be treated in the same way that they would want to be treated. These came from the old law, and they were the foundation of the old law. And that should have been recognized by the people of Israel. So I hope that gives you at least something more to think about in regards to this question. It is appropriate for us to investigate that which we don't understand about the Bible. There's nothing wrong with trying to make sense out of difficult questions. Maybe someone attacks the Bible with these questions, or maybe we just don't understand it and we want to know more. I hope this helps us at least clear up misconceptions if there are things we believed that were in the old law that aren't actually there, such as kidnapping, slave trading, basically chattel slavery, which is treating someone like property that can just be discarded. That was not the way that God gave them a law. I hope it also gives us maybe a more nuanced look at the law itself, to understand that the law was not a reflection of God's ultimate will. It was a guardian for the people to try and keep them in check, to do what you can with the wicked hearts of men, to have a nation that could bring Christ into the world. And so I hope that gives us something to think about, and this last slide gives us something to think about in our own lives. I've asked before and thought before, I wonder what future generations will look back on in our time, in the 21st century, and think, how could those people have possibly lived that way? How were they so blind to the fact that what they were doing was not God's will? As we look back on slavery, for instance, and if the people had taken these two great commandments and put them first and followed all the instructions that God gave concerning slavery, to treat someone as you wanted to be treated, if it was entered into only voluntarily because of debts that were owed, etc., what a difference that would have made. And I wonder what difference it will make in our lives if we will put these 2 commandments at the head of everything. And what if our society would do that? How many problems would that solve? And so that is a takeaway that you can take from this, in addition to hopefully a greater understanding of the old law and of objections that might be raised against God's character because of the things that he allowed to be in that law. And so with that, I extend an invitation. It's kind of hard to transition from a sermon about slavery in the old law to your opportunity to be baptized into Christ for the remission of sins. That invitation is always open and available and so important and urgent. And if you haven't done that, I ask you to think about it seriously, to realize the necessity of it. And if we can help you in any other way, by praying for you, or if you'd like to confess sin or anything that we can do for you, you can come as we stand and sing.